So Dr. Aliza Inbal founded and currently leads the Pears program for global innovation, which is an Olam partner, which collaborates with the Israeli government, private and entrepreneurial sectors to develop policies and programs to transform Israel into an important source of innovation, targeting development challenges. One of Israel's top experts in innovation ecosystems for inclusive innovation, she's been responsible for the design and launch of several innovative Israeli government programs to support Israeli technology innovation for development. She was chosen in 2012 by an Israeli national newspaper as one of the 100 most influential Jews in the world for her impact on Israel's approach to inclusive technology innovation. Prior to this, she was a senior evaluation officer at the World Bank, where she led large evaluation studies. And I understand, Aliza, you're back doing more work with the World Bank.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Great. So I will pass it along to you to share with us expertise on monitoring and evaluation. And I will share the screen.
Fabulous. Well, great. It's really nice to see you all. And I'm always very excited also when I see people that I don't know. One of the first things that I did when starting the Pears program was I did for the Pears Foundation this really large survey of all of the Jewish organizations and everyone who was involved in international and Israeli organizations involved in international development humanitarian aid. And that was about 10 years ago. And it's really exciting and gratifying to see how the ecosystem has grown and how this community of practice has grown over the past decade. As I was saying, is that I think that the difference is that that monitoring and evaluation is in a way is an essential part of doing ethical development. So just doing it is a part of doing a development ethically, in the sense that I think that there was a mindset in the bad old days of development where, obviously if our intentions are good, then our actions will be good too. And probably in ways it might be good that we ended up doing this as the last session in all of these sessions, because I'm sure one of the things that have become abundantly clear in all the sessions you've done is how untrue a value proposition that is, and how often good development intentions end up with bad or even damaging effects. And so this presentation will be a little bit different in the sense that part of it is just about what it means to do good monitoring evaluation, because good monitoring evaluation is an ethical imperative in and of itself. So let us move to the next slide. All right, so the first thing you have to ask yourself when you're doing monitoring evaluation is, what's the purpose of it? And when I'm being brought on to do an evaluation, the first thing I ask is, why are you doing it? And normally there are two different reasons to do evaluations. One is accountability and the other is learning. And you can have an evaluation which is entirely about accountability and not about learning. You can have one which is entirely about learning and really isn't about accountability, or you can have both. So what does this all mean? An accountability evaluation is an evaluation where the purpose of it is to say this is what we did and these were the results. It's a results evaluation is another way of saying it. So we were talking about accountability and the importance of accountability in order for us to understand what the true effects of what we've done is. It's really important, though, when you're even thinking about accountability, to understand accountability to whom. And I assume that at some point in time, this did come up in the series about the fact that being accountable to your donors, being accountable to the citizens of the country that has funded what you're doing, or being accountable to your beneficiaries, or being accountable to the government of your beneficiaries are all very different things. And part of what you have to think about and be conscious about when you're designing your evaluation is who you're being accountable to. And I think that one of the easiest or the most obvious thing is obviously you're accountable to your donors, because those are the ones who want to see the data and those are the ones who provide the money. But if you're accountable to your donors and ask the questions your donors want you to ask, but don't really gather knowledge when you have the opportunity to that brings value to your beneficiaries, then I think that you're missing an opportunity, an important opportunity to really understand how your interventions have affected the populations. And so it's good to bear that in mind and try to balance between the two to the extent possible. And it's not always perfectly possible. Now, a learning evaluation is an evaluation which is not about the results, but it's about why you achieved the results you did. So learning evaluations often look at the process you had to achieve the results and tell you, like if I'll give as an example, the Pears Challenge, which is a program we run, which it's an accelerator program to build new startups that have technologies for development. So accountability evaluation says, well, what we're going to do now is we're going to tell you how many startups were created, how much money they raised, how many of them made it to the field. A learning evaluation says, was what we were teaching any good? Did we give them all the knowledge and skills that they needed in order to be able to actually achieve this? So the learning part of it is a part of it which explains to you what worked and what didn't. And you do that both so that next time you do it better, and also ideally so that you can share with others your lessons from this. So normally now, very often you'll find that there's an element of accountability and an element of learning in most evaluations that you do, which seems like a good idea, but it also has to be managed. And it has to be managed in the sense that when you're doing an evaluation, you're talking normally to a large range of people. So some of the people you talk to might be the beneficiaries of the program. Some might be other stakeholders that you're working with, like government officials. Some might be the people who actually ran the program, particularly when you're dealing with learning evaluations. So you're talking to the program managers and you're asking them what worked and what didn't, and how did this work and how did it not. And one of the things that an evaluator has to be really conscious of, no matter what evaluation they're doing and no matter who they're speaking to, whenever they are actually gathering data, speaking to people and getting their perspectives, is the issue of trust, right? Because if you go to a person and you say to them, like a beneficiary of a program, and you say the program was good, if they don't feel comfortable saying, no, the program was crap, then everybody will come back and say, excellent program, fabulous, we loved it so much, it was great, but they may not say that to other people, or they may not think that. So building of trust is very important. And the problem with accountability and learning evaluations is that when people know that their score is being given to something, they're likely to be less open about discussing what went wrong. Certainly for the people who are running the program, but also sometimes for the people who are beneficiaries and don't want to appear ungrateful, don't want to get people in trouble that they were working with, and so on and so forth. And there is no, this is the way you do it so it doesn't happen, but these are the things you have to be mindful of. And then the last thing I'll say about that is this question of, do you need an external evaluator? And you might think, oh, well, if I'm going to evaluate my own project, obviously I'm not objective, and so that's not a good thing to do. And that's actually not entirely true. I mean, part of it is, it really does depend. I'll give you the example of the World Bank, which has probably one of the best and most in-depth evaluation processes for all of what they do in the world. They make a lot of mistakes, I will acknowledge, but they also do a lot to learn from their mistakes. And there, what they do is every project, the project managers in cooperation with the government do an evaluation of, and then a quarter of those are reviewed by independent evaluators. And then a certain percentage of those actually have an in-depth evaluation done by independent evaluators on top of the desk review. Because very often you can do your own evaluation, and obviously ethically you should say the good and the bad, but very often you're dealing with concrete facts that you can present and bring out there. But you have to always be mindful about whether or not people are going to feel comfortable speaking to you, and also about what are the instances where you need that extra credibility of having someone come from the outside and give that input. So let's move on to the next slide. All right, I'm going to share with you, and this will be in your resources, two basic sets of guidelines for ethical monitoring and evaluation, one of which is actually just guidelines for ethical research, because evaluation is a form of research. The question is, did this work well and what can we learn from it? And everything that you do to answer that question is really a research tool. And so at the end, you'll get both the American Evaluation Association's framework and also the Lean Research Framework, which was developed by MIT and by Tufts. MIT is DLab, which does development work, and Tufts, which I think brings a very useful extra perspective. So next slide. This is where my fabulous animation comes in. All right, let's stop there. Yeah, you can go for the first. All right, so the first set of ones you'll see when you look through them, the first set of things just have to do with basic research, like professional research, that you have to be data-based, you have to be methodical, thorough, contextually relevant, talk about what the limitations are, say what you don't know or what you can't be sure of, get professional people to do it and be honest and transparent, which is always a good thing to do if you want to be ethical. Yael, can you kick in the next one, or Graham, whoever's doing it? And that in the Lean Research Framework is in 4 words, just follow good research practices. Next, let's do the next 2. Next. All right, respectful is something like as a concept that I think the Lean Research Framework really highlighted in a way that the Evaluation Association didn't. And I think it's a really important concept for people who work in development. Because respect for people in the basic American Evaluation Association definition said, you should honor the dignity, well-being of individuals and acknowledge influence of culture, all good things. But what the Lean Research Framework said is that you have to be respectful of the value of people's time as well. And maximize, and that means that particularly when you're talking to beneficiaries, much more so than other program managers or government or whatever it is, even government, you have to really understand that these people are sacrificing their time for you, and that may seem like a little thing, but when you're dealing with, if you're in a village and you've had 10 different evaluators come to you for 5 different interventions over the course of a month, and each time you're expected to travel into the village center and to put aside your time, and to, like, these are very major demands. And this is something, one of the reasons the Lean Research Framework was developed was because there was an understanding that is particularly in development, that very often, like, there's one developer and then, or evaluator, and then another one, and then another one, and a program team, and so on and so forth, and people are constantly being asked to give of their time. And that's just not fair. And we do all the time, and within the level of donors, there's been a lot of talk about harmonization of evaluation standards, so that we don't have 10 different donors asking for 10 different reports from the Ministry of Agriculture on what the Ministry of Agriculture did in a year, which is what normally happens now. And that's true on a government level, but it's also true on the level of when you're going to different community level beneficiaries, that you really have to be respectful of their time and give them an opportunity both to benefit from the research you're doing and to enjoy it. So if we talked about accountability to whom, part of that is number one, trying to develop or get that is directly useful for them. And then the other part, which is way too often not done, is actually bothering to reach back to them when you're done and sharing with them the results of the research you did. Because what happens more often than not is that they give their time, they answer all these questions, and then they never hear back, and they don't know what was the result of it, what was done with it, and that's a very big issue. Next. The next 2, yeah, and the next one. And so common good and equity, oops, go back. Yes. In the American Evaluation Guidelines, here is translated to relevant and to right-sized. So once again, relevant, you should really think not only about what your donors or what your bosses need, but also what is relevant for the community. And right-size means sometimes I see people and they put together these questionnaires and they ask like 10 or 20 different questions, which are nice to have, but you don't really need to know. Don't do that. Ask the stuff you absolutely need to ask. And every time you write a question, know why that question matters. Like, put in your mind the sentence that's going to be in your evaluation report that's going to come from that data point. And if you don't have a sentence, don't do it because you're wasting people's time. Let's move on. Okay, the most important thing that in terms of the ethics of evaluation, like the ethics of all research, is informed consent. Never speak to anyone, particularly a beneficiary of the program. You can probably speak to your colleague and ask them what they thought of the program without doing this, but without explaining why you're doing the research, what commitment you're asking. We're going to talk to you for 10 minutes. We're going to have a survey that's going to take 1 hour, making sure they understand that they have the right to refuse, how their information will be used. And you can say it's confidential. You can say it's not confidential. You can say we're going to take out an ad in the New York Times and quote you here. It's not unethical to do that. You just have to make sure that they know and that they have, before or after, the right to say, I don't want myself quoted, or I don't want you to talk about this, or I don't want you to pass this on. And then there's the question of the benefits they'll receive from participating. I can't remember, I have another slide coming up on this whole issue of benefits, but you have to tell them whether or not, we're going to share with you the results of this afterwards. We hope that this is something which might lead to such changes or not. And participants should actively express agreement. And in that whole process, you have to be, and particularly when you're working with power imbalances or perceived power imbalances, you have to be very, very sure that people feel comfortable saying no. And that they understand that just because you're standing there and you have a white lab coat on or a clipboard or whatever is your sign that of your authority, it doesn't mean they have to answer you. And do make clear to them that if they are going to answer you, that it's very important that they give truthful answers, because this will be used too, and then explain to them why those truthful answers are important. So that's informed consent, and whether you're doing a written survey or an interview or a focus group, that has to be done. Next. All right, so we have 3 basic ways of gathering information: observation, one-on-one interviews, and focus groups. I'm not going to go in great depth into when you use one and when you use the other and how you do them and all of that, because both in the interest of time and because we're trying to focus a little bit more on the ethical parts of it. But let's move on. Okay, but here are a few tips for each. So with surveys and interviews, again, I'm going to emphasize this point that your surveys and interview have to be as brief as possible. You're trying to save people's time, not waste people's time. It's really important that you test the survey questions. So if you write a survey, you shouldn't write the survey and then immediately send it out to 100 people. You write the survey and you try to make sure with someone who is of the same profile of the sort of people you want to ask that your questions are culturally appropriate, they're necessary, they're clear. You should think a lot about who should be asking the questions. Should it be you or a local person? Should it be in your language or in a local language? Should it be a woman or a man? If you're, I recently did a survey of women who were survivors of breast cancer, and the person who was actually contracted to do this evaluation and who wrote the survey was a man, but he hired me to do the interviews because he understood that women might not feel comfortable speaking to him. And so he was the health professional, but I was the one asking the questions. You also want to think about timing, when and where is most convenient and comfortable to conduct it. You don't want to interview a person in front of someone that they may not feel comfortable being truthful with. I once did an evaluation in Tokyo, and of a training institute of a training institute of one of the development banks that was in Tokyo, and the head of the evaluation institute insisted on being in the room with the people, his employees who I was interviewing, which is a sure sign that his employees are not going to say anything. And so I ended up, I mean, as it happens, the person who was my boss was a friend of the head of the institute, and there were all sorts of ethical issues around that evaluation anyways. And the only way that I could actually do my job in an ethical way was to sneak back and to re-talk to all of the people that I had spoken to in a totally informal way in order to get them to feel more comfortable. But that's not a good practice. So Yael, you had asked me to give examples of bad practice in M&E. So that would be an example of bad practice when the head of the institute that you're evaluating is sitting in the room with all the people you're evaluating or you're asking to evaluate. This is just a general point of evaluation. That's not a matter of ethics, but question order matters. You go from general to specific because if you ask something like, if you like are surveying people about fruit and you say to them, what do you think about, what do you think about strawberries? And then afterwards say to them, what is your favorite fruit? There is a much higher likelihood they'll say strawberries than if you said, what is your favorite fruit? And then afterwards said, what do you think about strawberries? And then again, share wherever possible the study results with participants and also tell them how you're going to use these results. Next. All right. So with focus groups and group interviews, like some of these are just basic points on how to do them, but the ethical part of it is who is in the room. How do you make sure, like it's a lot more convenient doing a focus group because you get a lot of perspectives at once. And sometimes people build on the other. And so if you've got a good dynamic going, people will actually go deeper into issues than if you're doing a one-on-one interview. But the very big danger is number one, that not everyone will feel comfortable participating in a group. And number two, that you're going to get that you'll have a situation where more powerful people will speak and less powerful people will speak less or will be afraid of contradicting. So that might be the men in the room will feel more comfortable than the women in the room. It might be the village elders will be more more comfortable speaking, and then nobody will, will speak first and then nobody will want to contradict them. It might be that there's someone from a disenfranchised cultural group that is in the room and won't. So you have to be extremely careful when you're doing it. In some cases, it's only a matter of making sure to solicit the voices of the people in the room who are quieter. But in some cases, they just shouldn't be in the room because it's going to be harder for them to speak. And that's something you have to be super conscious of. Also, sometimes you want to have a note taker there alongside a facilitator, because then it'll enable you to focus a little bit better. You always, by the way, when you're doing interviews, mention that you're taking notes or that you're recording as part of your informed consent, and just make sure people feel comfortable with it. And sometimes, by the way, and this has happened to me before, I've had to memorize like a 1 hour long conversation because people have said they didn't want it written down. And that's just the way it is. And you have to respect that. Moving along. And once again, I just wanted to emphasize this whole issue of all voices matter. And when you're designing your evaluation, you have to really think about how you make sure that not only the most dominant voices are heard, and not only the majority, but also the minority, because sometimes your program will have an impact on your program will have an impact on the majority of people, but will have, but will have very adverse effects on a minority of people. And so you have to be conscious of who your program might have hurt that are not necessarily the people who are the main beneficiaries of your program. And when you're designing your evaluation, you have to think about that too. And think about how you get at that information about the people who might have been hurt by it rather than helped. Next. Yeah. All right. Observation is something which is less common in M&E, but it can exist, and it can be electronic. So for example, if you've done a hand washing like if you've done something, some kind of program in order to increase hygiene. And one of the things about increasing hygiene is you want to make sure that people are washing hands more. One way to do it is self-reporting, to get people to write down whenever they've washed their hands. But another way to do it might be to have a super cheap sensor, which records every time that a person washes their hands. And that's something which is actually being used nowadays. Like, not in all places and not everywhere. MIT D-Lab uses that as a way of evaluation, but there are ways to data gather through observation, which don't actually involve on sitting there and watching a person. But that's also a possibility. You can sit in a room and see a dynamic between people, and like there are lots of ways that you could actually physically observe rather than asking questions. You can sit in the central square and see who's coming and what they're doing. You can go to the well and see what's going on there. So there are ways to do observation, and that's another data gathering tool. It's less common. Next. All right, so thinking about the user experience, and here we go back again to this whole idea of respectful, and this broadened idea of respectful, of not wasting people time and making it fun. So you find ways to do games, to do it, and there's plenty of stuff online. I don't know if Elise shared some of you. She's got her in her session, but she's got a whole catalog of games for community participation. And then there's the issue of compensation. I spoke with Yael about this before. Compensation does not necessarily mean paying money, though it could mean giving people money for the travel expenses that they had in order to come and speak to you. But a compensation of some sort or another, particularly for people who it's not their jobs to work with you. So beneficiaries of programs, not necessarily government officials, where there are other ethical issues with compensating them, to at least like if you're talking to bring like pop soda for Americans, or for some Americans, bring biscuits or cookies, bring something that make people feel that you're showing them appreciation for their time. You want to pay attention to their body language and their surroundings and their comfort levels and all. And of course, you have to think a lot about what it means to, like, how you're going to gather information on sensitive topics that you need to know to really understand the impact of your program. Next. All right, so you want to spend time understanding general context, understanding, like, don't assume you understand why people, like if people say, I did this or I didn't do that, you want to ask why. The whys are important because you learn things that sometimes you miss things in just the original question. And if you're already interviewing in an interview format, the whys are important. You want to make sure to not only ask about what doesn't work, but also what does work. And the next one is super important as an ethical point, that you don't want to enable false expectations to be set. And this is a huge, huge, huge issue when you're interviewing beneficiaries of a program, because beneficiaries of a program will often, they'll like, you sit there, you speak to them and they say, you know, this wasn't good and that needs to be improved and that should be done better. And then you go away and they never hear from you again. And they don't know what's happened and all of that. Or sometimes like the evaluation you're doing, because the project has ended already, is not actually going to help anyone who's going to, and you know from in advance, it's not going to help anyone. And you have to be very honest about that. And I always, at the end of a conversation, and thanking people for speaking to me, I always am very honest, and I'm actually also very apologetic often in saying, you know, thank you very much for talking to us. I really hope, I'm going to take this information, I'm going to pass it on to X. I really hope that they're going to be able to use this information to improve future projects that they do. I know that the project here has already ended, so maybe it's not necessarily something you're going to be able to benefit from. I wish I could tell you that that wasn't the case, but hopefully when they do future projects here or in other places, this will make a difference. So I think that like you have to be very honest with people and also deliver the bad news, because there is usually an expectation, I'm going to say this and something is going to happen, I'm going to get something. And more often than not, that isn't the case. And moving right along, here are, we already talked about compensation. So the 5 takeaways that I was asked to do is, once again, informed consent, the issue of respectfulness of people's time, of sensitivity towards their cultural needs, their religious needs, the importance of giving voice to the voiceless. And that sometimes also means going to people who weren't the beneficiaries of the program, but who, for one reason or another, may have been affected by the program that, that you've done. And of course, telling the whole truth in terms of being, it is like super, 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 super unethical, even though it's awful tempting when you're reporting back to your donors to only talk about the good things that happened, say, and gloss over or shunt aside the negative things. And I think that with the majority of donors, if you're honest about the negative things, but also explain why that didn't work and what could be improved in future times, then they'll respect that rather than seeing this as a sign of failure. And truthfully, if it was a failure, then you have to say that. If it didn't work, then you have to say that, because that isn't a very important element of evaluation, is saying the truth, and that's important for your credibility going further on. Next, here are the resources. And now we come to questions.